Welcome back, everyone, especially those of you who have soldiered through the past 9 episodes. I thank you all for listening and sticking with the program till the very end, which will be this 10th episode of the series. I'd also like to express my gratitude to those of you who, since part 1, have emailed me and shared your own personal experiences related to some of the historic moments mentioned over the past few episodes at least. And also to those Singaporeans who wrote to me and added context to what I was mentioning and corrected me where I didn't get things precise. And also to all my new Patreon and CHP Premium subscribers in Singapore and Malaysia, now supporting my humble efforts. So we'll finish off the history of Singapore here. We looked at about 700 years, more or less, of Singaporean history and its many incarnations, Temasek, Singapura, as part of Malayan sultanates under the British, as the Strait Settlements, and as a colony under the Japanese, as part of Malaysia. And then in this final episode of the series, we'll explore this island's present incarnation, today's modern nation of Singapore. When we left off last time, Singapore was still a relatively new nation. The Founding Fathers, and we looked at a few of them, guided Singapore to independence in and out of Malaysia and exhibited grit and determination and more than a few brilliant moments of good leadership and governance. And thanks to their policies and with a little help from their friends, Singapore, by the 1970s and 80s, was a player in global financial, shipping, and high-tech markets. Contributing to Singapore's booming economy was the U.S. government during the Vietnam War years. I mentioned before that Lee Kuan Yew thoroughly ingratiated himself with the Johnson and Nixon administrations and gave his unwavering support during the Vietnam War, or the Resistance War against America, as it was referred to in Vietnam. It wasn't the sole reason for Singapore's economic success in the 1970s, but all that U.S. direct investment sure helped. When the Brits pulled out of Sembawang, it was feared that dark clouds would descend on Singapore. But before the potential storm hit, Uncle Sam rode in and helped fill that void left by Britain's exit from this massive naval base that we discussed in Part 5. We ended with a brief mention about certain government limitations placed on personal freedoms. Lee and the PAP, after learning from the experiences in the 1950s and 60s, adopted a policy of discouraging any opposition, political or otherwise, to get in the way of policies, laws, and regulations they enacted. That was the gimme demanded from the public in exchange for a prosperous Singapore with living standards and public amenities that were the envy of the world. Shoot, I wish I could live there. So freedom of the press, speech, freedom of assembly, stuff like that. Our First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, to draw a comparison, that was controlled. Now, in 2024, with AI, social media, and its algorithms, the global misinformation and news distortion complex, this doesn't sound as bad as it once did. The PAP remained rock solid politically, dominating election after election in 1972, 1976, and 1980, always winning by a landslide. But in 1981, for the first time in a long time, a PAP candidate was defeated in a by-election when Devon Nair stepped down as MP from the Anson constituency to become president of Singapore. The PAP lost in the by-election to fill the vacant seat to the Workers' Party candidate J.B. Jeyaretnam, and he became an unwelcome opposition voice in the PAP-dominated government, a harbinger of things to come in the 1984 elections. Before we get to the 1984 election and the consequences, let me quickly mention Changi Airport, which opened in 1981. It replaced Paya Lebar Airport, which in 1954 replaced Kallang Airport. Paya Lebar was later converted into a military air base. And as I said, the world-renowned Singapore Changi Airport replaced it in 1981 as the country's new international airport. To construct this engineering and architectural marvel, they started reclaiming land by filling up the sea around Changi. 12 million cubic meters of earth was moved to expand the size of the footprint of the new airport. The Great Pyramid of Egypt was only about 2.6 million cubic meters, so Singapore's construction workers moved the equivalent of 4.5 Great Pyramids worth of rocks and dirt that was used as both landfill and sea fill. About 1,700 acres of land was reclaimed from the sea, and the world-famous Singapore Airlines, based at Changi Airport, evolved out of the post-World War II Malayan Airways, founded in 1946. In 1963, with the country name change, Malayan Airways became Malaysian Airways, then Malaysia-Singapore Airways. And during the period of this 6-year merged airline, the flight attendants began wearing the signature sarong kebaya uniforms, and the iconic Singapore Girl ad campaign ran from the very start of the airline's history and became one of the most recognizable airline marketing campaigns in the world. In the spirit of non-cooperation that came as a result of the failed merger in 1963, the airline ceased operation in 1972, and that marked the start of MAS and SIA, Malaysian Airlines System and Singapore Airlines. May 12, 1981, the first flight, SQ-140, touched down in London. Singapore Airlines, like Goh Keng Swee's economic policy, looked to the whole world as its market. There was rapid expansion with purchases of new aircraft and obtaining new international destinations. And by the summer of 1973, Singapore Air was flying the new Boeing 747s that were first introduced in 1969. And right from the start, Singapore Air differentiated itself from the competition through the introduction of premium services that set the standard in the industry. Skytrax, created in 1989, has named Singapore Air the world's best airline 5 times. And having flown them, I could tell you everything they say is true. And Changi Airport, Skytrax has awarded them best airport in the world 12 times already. From 2013 to 2020, 8 consecutive years, they won the award. And when they don't rank first, they're always in the top 3. A bunch of other travel-related publications and organizations also consistently rave about this airport. So, back to politics. The 1984 election was the first one with the new guard in place. Lee Kuan Yew was still serving as PM. One thing noteworthy about the 1984 elections was that it allowed these non-constituency members to serve in Parliament. Up to 3 losing opposition candidates in an election, to serve as MPs. It didn't allow for a real opposition in Parliament, but it was a baby step in the right direction. A lot of voters in 1984 sent a message to the PAP that they were tired of their patronizing governance of the country. Mind you, they still won 77 of 79 seats in Parliament, but the PAP share of the popular vote fell from 75.5% to 64.8%, an alarming drop. The 2 opposition parties, the Singapore Democratic Party and the Workers' Party, each won a seat. The PAP still reigned supreme, but unlike before, now there were other voices in Parliament to push back on matters that previously didn't need to be debated. And J.B. Jeyaretnam was always quite masterful at giving fiery speeches. So from here on out, beginning with this 1984 election, more and more opposition began to have their voices heard. Let's quickly look at the second generation of leadership in Singapore who began to come to the fore beginning in the 1984 election. Last time we saw how all the most important and influential old guard leaders began to retire so that by the end of the 1980s, all who remained from that heroic and historic period was Lee Kuan Yew. In 1984, he was only 61 years of age. And PM Lee, he didn't know it back in 1984, but he still had 31 more years to go, so he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Let me introduce a few of the new faces of the next generation of leadership. The one who would go on to succeed Lee Kuan Yew as Prime Minister was Tong. He had served as the deputy PM and, as some historians remarked, as a placeholder for Hsien once he was ready to take over. LKY handed power to Tong on November 28, 1990, and Go's years in the top spot ran till 2004. Go indicated he was going to wear a softer, more velvety glove than his illustrious, historic, and venerable predecessor. For his 13 years as PM, starting in 1990, Tong tried to tone down the more objectionable parts of the previous leadership's policies. For example, he allowed for some freedoms to speak out. Downtown at Hong Lim Park, a kind of democracy wall forum was allowed. People could come out and publicly air their grievances, as long as they didn't criticize the government. Go's administration tried to bring some loosening to the restrictive laws. Another important figure was Shanmugam Jayakumar. Like his predecessor at the Foreign Ministry, S. Rajaratnam, and nobody could pronounce his first name either, so he too was known as S. Jayakumar. He was quite a versatile government leader. Between 1984 and 2011, S. Jayakumar served as Minister for Labor, for Home Affairs, Law, Foreign Affairs, and as Deputy Prime Minister, and finally as the fourth Senior Minister of Singapore. Tony Tan, like Jayakumar, served in several high-ranking positions in the government. Between 1981 and 2017, he served as Minister of Trade and Industry, for Education, Finance, Defense, as Deputy Prime Minister to Tong, and finally, between 2011 and 2017, as the seventh President of Singapore. The office of President of Singapore was created right after independence in August 1965. Initially, the role of the president was largely ceremonial and symbolic, carrying some residual powers. The President of the Republic of Singapore serves as the head of state and the one who represents Singapore in official diplomatic functions. The President has some executive powers over the government, including the power to revoke and choose public service appointments. The Constitution was later amended to provide for an elected president. Ong Teng Cheong became Singapore's first elected president in 1993. The current president, Singapore's ninth, is His Excellency Tharman Shanmugaratnam. Even though Tong was the prime minister starting in 1990, let me say again that it was an oft unmentioned fact that he was just keeping the PM seat warm until Lee Kuan Yew's son, Hsien, was ready to take over. And this would take 13 years, partly because in 1992, Hsien was diagnosed with lymphoma and remained in treatment and recovery until 1996, but he would eventually take over as PM in 2004. The second generation of leaders look very much like the previous founding generation of leaders. The 1980s was a period when people believed the times they were a-changing, but not that much in the Singaporean government was changing, and many Singaporeans were grumbling that the PAP-led government wasn't listening to them. The torch had been passed to a new generation of leadership, tasked to handle all the machinery of state that had been engineered and built by Singapore's first generation of leaders. After Tong became Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew stayed on as Senior Minister and kept his office at the palace where the PM's office is located, the Istana. He also made Hsien the Deputy PM with special responsibility for the economy and civil service matters. I know this is hard to believe, but 1985 saw the beginnings of a recession in Singapore. First time since independence. Pretty much, going all the way back to the time of Sang Nila Utama's sighting of the lion, Singapore's economy had been mostly one success story after another. I'm not sure how many of you recall, but back in the day, when Duran Duran, Wham, Aha, and Tears for Fears were at the top of the pops, the world economy was in crisis. These were the early Reagan years in the U.S. That rubber band snapped back in Singapore. After so many years of relentless expansion, real estate took a hit due to overinvestment, and rising costs were turning Singapore into a tough place to get by for many. The government allowed wages to go up, and that knocked Singapore out of the consumer goods manufacturing business. Global demand for the kind of high-end electronics Singapore produced went down. The collapse of global oil prices all had a negative effect on Singapore's refining and transshipment industry. It was after this recession when the government decided to focus investment in services over manufacturing. They tried to stabilize the economy using a variety of methods that worked and some that didn't work, but they got through it. And just when people started to believe that the more repressive aspects of the government were starting to let up, in May 1987 came Operation Spectrum. This action, taken by the ISD, the Internal Security Department, saw 22 social activists rounded up under the Internal Security Act. Many were associated with the Catholic Church, an alternative theater, and of course, lawyers and journalists. One of the church programs involved helping factory workers and migrants at the Loong Catholic Center and Jurong Workers Center. They taught them how to navigate the system in Singapore and advocated on their behalf. Although the suspects were arrested, they were never tried or convicted of the crime they were charged with, namely attempting to overthrow the Singapore government and replace it with a Marxist dictatorship. They weren't the bad old days of 1963. This was 1987. In our time, sadly, this sort of thing seems to happen somewhere in the world quite regularly. But in Singapore? Seriously? The government caught a heck of a lot of flack for that move, and not just from all the Western liberal democracies of the world. NGOs on 5 continents also feasted on the boldness of the government in this matter of Operation Spectrum. The worldwide press also had a field day with this one. Didn't do much to advance Singapore's global soft power. The manner in which it was handled and all the post-detention interviews of detainees in the press about being tortured and forced to make confessions caused a fall in the share price of the citizens' confidence in their government. The big three of the next generation, Deputy Prime Minister Goh Tong, Home Affairs Minister S. Jayakumar, and Hsien Loong, then a junior minister, became the face of this foul-smelling matter. LKY, he didn't have any problem with the arrests and detention. Even with hundreds of organizations and brand-name politicians from all the great countries registering protests and expressing condemnation for the arrests and detention, well, Lee Kuan Yew didn't back down. He was a big-picture guy. Events happening domestically and regionally all had to be considered in making as drastic a decision as this. This matter of Operation Spectrum from 1987 is still being debated in the 2020s. The way he saw things, with this kind of new leadership in place, willing to nip anything rhyming with communism in the bud, he felt it was now safe enough for him to finally step down and hand the prime ministership to Goh. I mentioned that one of these church groups who had members detained helped migrant laborers who did all the jobs migrant laborers usually do, mostly building infrastructure. So many imported workers had been brought in by 1987, 1.5 million by some estimations. That was more than enough for this phenomenon to become a social problem. New efforts continued to be made to transition to a more kinder, gentler nation. In 1988, the group representation constituency was introduced that sought to offer more representation to non-ethnic Chinese citizens. Then, in 1990, a second class of MPs appointed by Parliament were also allowed to serve. These were called non-elected, non-partisan MPs or nominated MPs. They were meant to assuage popular demand for something other than the same old political meatloaf served every night. Nobody could vote for them. If the PAP thought they'd fit the bill, they were nominated. This was referred to as a consultative authoritarian regime. Others criticized it as a pretend opposition. In November 1990, Lee Kuan Yew, then 67 years young, stepped down as PM. It was time. He didn't step all the way down, though. Lee remained in the cabinet as a senior minister. In August 1991, snap elections were held. As the new guy in charge, Tong was looking for a mandate on his policies. The PAP lost 2 more seats. Opposition now held 4 seats, the largest since 1965. But they could never get it all together to put sufficient heat on the eternally ruling party. Something interesting happened in 1994. I remember it so well. I'm sure all Singaporeans living back then remember. There was this American expat kid who lived there named Michael Fay. Back in September of 1993, he and a bunch of other teenagers went around stealing road signs and vandalizing 18 cars over a 10-day period. Long story short, he and the other boys got caught and had to face the reality of the Singapore justice system. I was living in Hong Kong at the time, but I did follow U.S. news, and this was a big deal. Basically, the American public, egged on by their politicians, the media, and even President Bill Clinton, got all bent out of shape over the sentence that called for a good old-fashioned caning and a few months in the slammer. The American press framed it as a kind of, how dare they apply their laws to us, type of brouhaha. And it really put the Singapore-USA relationship to a stress test. Clinton milked this for all it was worth. Due to all the pressure put on Singapore by the U.S. government, Fay's sentence was later reduced from 6 to 4 strokes of the cane, as well as reduced jail time. The other students sentenced to the same punishment also had their penalty reduced from 12 strokes to 6. Michael Fay was caned on May 5th, 1994, at the Queenstown Remand Center. Needless to say, both nations survived this tempest in a teapot. And prior to this, in 1992, there was another bit of news that got sensationalized. This was when the Singapore government prohibited the import, sale, and manufacture of chewing gum. The stuff couldn't be sold or imported into Singapore. And if anyone got caught with selling chewing gum, well, they faced a stiff fine and up to 2 years in the big house. Well, those for the new law were sick and tired of stepping on it on the sidewalks and seeing gum stuck all over public transport and under seats. In any case, this was another one of those things. People all over the world sort of got a kick out of this, and it generated quite a few punchlines, I'm sure. I haven't chewed gum since I was a kid, so there were no complaints from me. In 2004, they made exceptions for nicotine gum and the sugar-free type, but you had to get it from a pharmacist. Singapore emerged from the disastrous 1997 Asian financial crisis somewhat unscathed. This meltdown across Asia affected me personally, and I remember it well. GDP growth dropped from 8.4% to 1.4% due to the degraded state of the Southeast Asian regional economy. Compared to everyone else's currency in Southeast Asia, Singapore got off easy. Strong foreign reserves and a sound monetary policy has its benefits. The Sing dollar did drop 20% against the USD, though. The Straits Times Index fell 60%. In short, the region took a massive and painful hit, and many of Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia's problems became Singapore's problems. But by 1999, Singapore began to bounce back. The 2003 SARS outbreak hit Singapore's tourism and the retail sector hard. 238 confirmed cases and 33 deaths, over 8,000 people quarantined. Tan Tock Seng Hospital, first mentioned in Part 3 of this series, served as the primary SARS treatment center. The government's response was admirable, and many of the measures taken came in handy when COVID hit in early 2020. These were all emergencies that fell in the lap of Goh Tong and his administration. You know, the first and third PMs of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew and Hsien Loong, they usually get all the attention. There was this old joke that sort of poked fun at Goh Tong's invisibility compared to Lee Sr. and Jr. It described the Singapore leadership trinity as Father, Son, and the Holy Go. Every leader of nations, great and not that great, all share at least one infallibility, that being the occasional gaffe or political decision that backfired. But between 1990 and 2004, when Goh Tong led the government, a lot got done. I was living in Hong Kong when Goh was serving as PM, so I used to read about Wu Zuo Dong, as he's called in Mandarin, practically every day. On the economic front, as we saw in the last episode, a lot happened very fast, and all of this explosive growth needed a breather to consolidate before the government knew how to get to the next level from where Singapore found itself in the 1990s. The focus was on promoting a knowledge-based economy that was heavy on science and information technologies and attracting foreign investment. There was also much done to shore up domestic entitlement programs, primarily through the Central Provident Fund, first set up in 1955, and Medisave, launched in 1985. Medisave was similar to these HSAs, or health savings accounts, we have in the U.S. Singapore's Medisave called for 6.5% to 9% of employees' monthly salaries siphoned off to their personal Medisave account, and when one became ill or faced a medical emergency, this money could be used to pay hospital bills for themselves or their immediate family members. Singapore's healthcare system is consistently ranked as one of the top 5 in the world. Don't get me started on the American system. It has some of the finest hospitals and physicians in the world, but access to this care remains a national problem. Medisave is under the CPF, or Central Provident Fund, which, like American Social Security, serves as a compulsory comprehensive savings and pension plan that funded the retirement, healthcare, and housing needs of the people of Singapore. And like with Social Security, both employees and their employers kick in a mandated amount to the CPF. Public housing in Singapore, as great as it was, by the 1990s was both in short supply and in dire need of upgrades. That too was addressed. Regionally, Goh Tong worked tirelessly to engage with other ASEAN nations and increase trade opportunities. He reached out to China and India to build new bridges and to cooperate on many economic endeavors. Despite Operation Spectrum in 1987, Goh's style and willingness to field public opinions on matters of national importance was a breath of fresh air. When he stepped down in 2004, he left a very healthy Singapore in place for Hsien Loong to govern. You know, it was a very formidable challenge to step into the shoes of someone the likes of Lee Kuan Yew. The praise for Goh Tong's leadership when he was PM far outweighs the criticism. On August 11, 2004, after 14 years serving as deputy PM to Goh Tong, Hsien Loong became the third Singapore PM. And you could be sure having Lee Kuan Yew as a father was going to be both beneficial yet challenging for the new PM, especially with respect to exercising complete authority. For the first 6 or 7 years serving as PM, Hsien Loong sometimes had to yield to parental interference in Singapore's internal affairs. Although Lee Kuan Yew had stepped down as PM in 1990, he remained the senior minister until Hsien Loong took over. From 2004 to 2011, he created a new position called Minister Mentor, which allowed Lee Kuan Yew to keep one hand on the government steering wheel from the back seat of the car. 2005, Lee Hsien Loong launched a program to boost immigration and mitigate some of the demographic challenges posed by an aging population and low birth rates. Immigration policies were relaxed that made it easier for foreign professionals, skilled workers, and their families to settle in Singapore. Foreign professional workers, especially those in key industries like finance, technology, and healthcare, were encouraged to apply for permanent residency. These immigration reforms helped Singapore attract a larger pool of foreign talent, boosting its labor force and supporting key industries. During this period leading up to 2011, the PAP lead in Parliament started to erode slightly. In most democracies, well, this usually means the voting public isn't 100% completely satisfied. All the migrant workers and the flip side of the coin that imported cheap labor often brings was irking a lot of people. And like it is in my country, middle-class folk were struggling to afford their own homes, pay for the cost of living in such a fine place, and being able to afford this great health care that Singapore's physicians and hospitals offered. They didn't get the shellacking that the Democrats got in the 2012 U.S. election, but in 2011, the PAP had its worst outing since independence in 1965, getting only 60% of the vote. This often happens when countries transition from low income to relative prosperity. After suffering such a loss, Lee Hsien Loong stepped up and took full responsibility and was contrite with his response to the citizenry. The senior minister and the minister mentor positions were let go. That was a start. The elder Mr. Lee was 88 years old then. In 2013, he would begin suffering from medical conditions that often come with advanced age, and his health would continue to decline. On March 23, 2015, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong went on national TV to announce the death of his father, Lee Kuan Yew. He lived to 91, by any reckoning. That's a ripe old age. He almost made it to the 50th anniversary celebration of Singapore's independence, something he played a leading role in. From the past episodes of this series, it was plain to see he was, without peer, the dominant figure in modern Singaporean history going back to 1959. Lee Hsien Loong declared a 7-day period of national mourning. For a private wake, LKY's body was taken to Sri Temasek, the PM's official residence located in the Astana. 2 days later, he would lie in state at Parliament House. 500,000 people came to show their respects. And for the funeral cortege, more than 100,000 people braved heavy rain and lined the route, bowing their heads as his flag-draped coffin passed. Air Force jets flew in formation overhead. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon attended the funeral. Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak led the delegation from Malaysia. Bill Clinton and Henry Kissinger were there, representing the U.S. Chinese Vice President Li Yuanchao attended on behalf of Xi Jinping. Indian PM Narendra Modi was there. Shinzo Abe, Tony Abbott, Joko Widodo, Sir Jerry Metapari, Lee Wan Koo, Hun Sen, Nguyen Tan Tong, all the leaders of the world's great nations were all represented by their government's heads of state or their representatives. Lee Kuan Yew was lionized by many leaders who recognized his contributions in building modern Singapore. Bill Clinton called Lee Kuan Yew, quote, the greatest Asian leader of our time. He was universally respected and admired. In the troubled times we all live in today, his wisdom is sorely missed. There was also another big event that happened in Singapore in 2015 when the Republic of China President Ma Ying-jeou and the PRC leader Xi Jinping met there to hold a meeting. I mentioned in the final episode of the 15-part series on the history of Taiwan that 7 years into the Ma Ying-jeou presidency, the time seemed to be right to take advantage of the momentum that had been gained in friendlier cross-strait relations. And as I said, everything about this meeting was meticulously orchestrated. If you recall, to get around the whole non-recognition problem, the two leaders called each other Mr. Ma and Mr. Xi rather than President. President Xi Jinping arrived the day before, on November 6, 2015, after a stopover in Vietnam. President Ma flew from Taipei to Singapore, escorted by the ROC Air Force. Ma and his entourage were whisked to the Singapore Four Seasons. Xi was staying at the Shangri-La, where the meeting was set to take place. Then, on November 7th, the two leaders met at the Singapore Shangri-La. Some of you may remember the big photo op of the two leaders shaking hands. 20 minutes later, Xi Jinping and Ma Ying-jeou were locked up in a room having their historic moment together. And after a nice dinner, they exchanged gifts, and that was that. And more recently, in June 2018, some of you may remember Singapore being one of the few nations who had diplomatic relations with both countries, hosted the summit between Kim Jong-un and Donald Trump. And while we're on the subject, let's wind things down here with a quick overview of Singapore-China bilateral relations. Because Singapore is, I guess you could say, a heavily ethnic Chinese population, Lee Kuan Yew always had to tread carefully with regard to his nation's relations with the People's Republic. His strong anti-communist stance and his cozy relationship with Uncle Sam, especially with the U.S. military, often made it challenging for Singapore at times. He wisely kept an eye on the other neighboring Southeast Asian nations and how they handled their PRC relationship. And once they had all established relations, only then did he move ahead with formal relations. Indonesia and Burma were first in 1950, Cambodia in 1958, Laos in 1961, Malaysia in 1974, Philippines and Thailand in 1975, and last but not least came Singapore on October 3rd, 1990. Though formal diplomatic relations didn't begin until then, there was still very robust unofficial relations, with trade, of course, playing a key role. One of the earliest projects to happen following the establishment of diplomatic relations was the famous 107-square-mile Suzhou Industrial Park that opened in February 1994. I remember when that first opened and how it was quite a big deal. The impetus for this high-profile project all started when no less a person than Deng Xiaoping himself, during his historic 1992 Southern tour, suggested the PRC look to Singapore to, quote, tap on their experience and learn how to manage better, end quote. The Suzhou Industrial Park between Singapore and China, however, encountered some rough seas when Suzhou officials announced the construction of a competing industrial park called the Suzhou New District Industrial Park. Lee Kuan Yew himself had to later admit Singapore got the shaft on this project. And for a while, this sort of dulled the appetite for future Singaporean investments in China. But things began to turn around in 2001, and some of the land was converted to residential flats, which sold briskly. Other high-profile Singaporean investments in China included the Sino-Singapore Tianjin Eco-City, Sino-Singapore Guangzhou Knowledge City, Singapore Sichuan High-Tech Innovation Park, and the Sino-Singapore Jilin Food Zone. In November 2002, Tong, on behalf of the Singaporean government, had signed the framework agreement for the ASEAN-China Free Trade Area. It was formally launched in 2010 and did what it was supposed to do, mainly upgrade the trade and economic integration between Singapore and the other 9 ASEAN nations and the PRC. When the Free Trade Area went into effect in 2010, trade volume was around $235 billion. By 2022, That number had shot up to $731 billion and surpassed $800 billion last year in 2023. Unlike most nations, Singapore has a nice, balanced trade with China. The key exports to China from Singapore are electronics, chemicals, refined petroleum products, and other ultra-high-tech equipment. The one sticking point between Singapore and China was, what else? The matter of Taiwan. With Singapore, geographically speaking, being so small, the Singapore Armed Forces perform military exercises in and around Taiwan. Just prior to taking over from Tong as Singapore PM, Hsien paid a visit to Taiwan to go have a look-see. This was in 2004. And when this was announced, you could be certain that everyone in Beijing who had a Zhongnanhai mailing address had their feelings hurt, I guess you could say. And when Prime Minister Lee sided with the Philippines following the July 2016 arbitral tribunal case that ruled in favor of the Philippines regarding the 9-dash line and the 2012 Scarborough Shoal fishing dispute, well, that didn't win him any friends in the Politburo either. Some of you may recall not long after, with all this tension percolating in the background, in November of 2016, the authorities in Hong Kong impounded 9 of Singapore's military Terex armored vehicles that had been laden on board an American President Line cargo vessel. They were en route back to Singapore following military exercises in Taiwan. China's authorities weren't that thrilled about such an arrangement as that and had, since 2002, welcomed Singapore to use Hainan as an alternative to Taiwan to stage their military exercises. But for their own reasons, the Singapore government stuck with Taiwan. After the whole matter got sorted out to both sides' equal dissatisfaction, APL had to take the fall, and the captain of the vessel was declared at fault for not properly filling out the right forms and whatnot that should have been filed for transporting this kind of cargo through the port of Hong Kong. Fines were paid, and jail time was served, and lessons were learned. And the following year, in May 2017, Hsien didn't get an invite to Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Forum. The optics of this suggested Singapore had wound up on President Xi's bad side. But at the April 2018 Boao Forum, the Boao Yazhou Luntan, everything got worked out and Singapore signed up for the BRI. Since then, Singapore has served as a financial and legal center for BRI projects in infrastructure, capital markets, and risk management. Singapore's flagship BRI project is the China-Singapore-Chongqing Connectivity Initiative, launched in 2015. This one aims to connect Western China with Southeast Asia. Because of its primo location, Singapore also plays a key role in the maritime portion of the BRI. Despite all the unpleasantness that past history has left us with that we in our time must continue to reconcile, there was one constant that has remained throughout the 7 centuries of Singapore's history, and that was, is, and no doubt forever will be, namely trade and commerce. Back in 1998, two-way trade between Singapore and the PRC was a little over $8 billion. Today, that number is more than 10 times as large and still growing. And with more recent history, some of you may recall following William Lai Ching-te's election as the 8th president of the ROC, Prime Minister Hsien expressed his hearty congratulations. In China, they didn't like that either. Singapore and Taiwan have a long-standing relationship, and as long as this matter remains unresolved, like with America, there's always going to be turbulence. So the point is, Singapore, like my own country, has to tiptoe along the same knife edge where this most sensitive of political matters is concerned. But on the other hand, many Singaporeans felt a bit queasy when Beijing called on all overseas Chinese to be loyal to China and to contribute to the country's growth. Just because Singapore's citizens are overwhelmingly ethnic Chinese, with ancestry that once left the safety and comfort of Fujian and Guangdong. As we have seen throughout this series, some felt this call by the party diminished the spirit of Singapore's multiracial society. Another interesting point is that when Singaporean and Chinese diplomatic and government officials meet in official capacities, English, not Mandarin, is the common language used. Now, this isn't true in every case, but officially, this is how they communicate. Again, it's a way of Singapore projecting its multiracial society rather than being a Chinese society. Yeah, if there's one thing you could glean from these past 10 episodes, it might be how Singapore became this one-of-a-kind nation, unique in the world, that always strived to remain close to what S. Rajaratnam dedicated his life to and inscribed in his country's Pledge of Allegiance. And this year, as I record this episode, on May 15th, 2024, the Honorable Lawrence Wong, Huang Xun became the 4th Prime Minister of the Republic of Singapore. And with that, I think we'll close the book for now. It's been 10 episodes and about 9 hours of your humble narrator, picking through the treasure chest of Singapore history, trying to bring you a mild understanding of this great land. Small as this island nation is, even smaller than my hometown of Los Angeles, its role in the history of the Chinese people and in this Southeast Asian region was and will continue to be significant and historic. And this year, in 2025, Singapore will celebrate 60 years of nationhood. I'm sure there will be a big party thrown, and I hope for those of you who didn't know much about the Lion City before, you now have a new sense of appreciation and admiration for its history and some of the people who played key roles going back to Sang Nila Utama to mold the culture and the destiny of Singapore. Many thanks to all of you for lasting this far. You must be tired of my voice by now. This is Laszlo Montgomery signing off from the beautiful and historic city of Phnom Penh in the Kingdom of Cambodia. I've been a band on the run these past 2 weeks, and I'm recording from the very studio of Dr. Digby James Wren of the Loong Mekong Substack and the Chair podcast. Dr. Wren was so kind to lend me his home studio here in PP to record this final episode. I'll have links to Digby's work in the show notes. Back to LA tomorrow night for yours truly. Please find it in your heart to come back again next time for another exciting episode of the China History Podcast.